Good morning, class. This is Dr. Padgett, Urban Geography, Geography 4850. This is the recorded lecture for Module 6. And so for Module 6, our main focus will be upon what we call urban inequalities. And as we know, with any urban area, there aren't going to be equal levels of income, equal levels of wealth, equal levels of access to healthcare, equal levels of healthcare access to food. And so obviously the focus is upon, how do we lessen these inequalities? How do we, we can't create a fair place for everyone. That's utopia, that's fantasy. But we can try to get as close as we can to the beloved community as possible, so that at least everybody has a chance at success and maximizing his or her potential. So I'm going to go to the course now and share my screen so that you can see what's going on my screen. And so here we are. Here is the course webpage. And today is May 11th. And so the assignment associated with this lecture today is Urban Inequalities Research and Essay Assignment. It's due on the 14th. And so we'll start with the first reading. So your first reading is Descriptive Models of Urban Structures. And then I want you to kind of glance at the changing shape of American cities. And when I say peruse, I mean just that, my philosophy of teaching and learning is exposure-based, in that 50% of learning happens through being exposed to new things. So I don't necessarily expect you to devour all of these readings, but I want you to at least focus upon something of interest within 5 or 6 of the readings and develop an essay based upon that, but I do want you to at least glance at all of them. But you have to read the first one, and I'm going to talk about that in a few moments. And I may as well just do it right now since I've mentioned it. So I'm going to go to course content, and you will find the research materials associated with this assignment. And the first one is, Descriptive Models of Urban Structure. So let's talk about that now for a moment or 2 or 3. So when cities develop, they tend to follow certain patterns. And so what we'll find, what we're going to focus on today, are patterns that cities follow in the United States and North America primarily. And that's where we are, that's where we're going to start. So there are several models of urban structure, and we're going to start with the model that most closely fits cities in North America, and that is the concentric zone model. And so notice that here we have a schematic diagram of the model with the center of the concentric zone model being the central business district, which, as you can see, is largely comprised of commercial space in the central business district. Sometimes we call this the downtown area. This is where municipal offices are. A lot of business headquarters are downtown, tall buildings, skyscrapers. Usually not a premium on residential, although we know that's changing. But historically, this was a more commercial and public space in Zone 1, Central Business District. Next, we have Zone 2, which is referred to as a zone of transition. Well, what are we transitioning from and towards? We're transitioning from a largely commercial and public space to residential. Again, this dynamic is changing now in recent years. But usually in the zone of transition, this is where we find a lot of light industries, maybe office furniture stores. In Nashville, there are a lot of microbreweries right outside of downtown, office machine businesses, maybe soft drink bottling plants, those types of industries, not steel mills and car plants and those types of heavy industries, just light industries like that we find in Zone 2. Now, of course, we do know that as we have moved into this era of gentrification and we've seen increased residential development in this zone of transition that we can perhaps discuss more on Thursday when this assignment is due and we have our live discussion. When we move farther out away from the centers of the city, we get into Zone 3, which historically has been where we find low-income housing. If you think of where you live, if you live in a large city, this is where you would find public housing. In Nashville, if we were to take a look at Nashville, you would find that Napier and Edge Hill Homes and John Henry Hale Homes and Casey Homes, all these large public housing communities are all within Zone 3. And right behind Tennessee State University was a large public housing community, which is still there, but it has been transitioned through Hope 6, the Preston Taylor Homes. Used to be a large, very large public housing community literally across the street from Tennessee State University. And so we at Tennessee State University are located within Zone 3. It's a relatively low income area. I'd say that the average household income at one time was around $10,000 to $20,000 a year. Like I said, relatively low income. That is changing through gentrification. But that's the community that Tennessee State University and many other HBCUs happen to be located. Next is middle income housing in Zone 4. Now we're getting out into Antioch, if you're in Nashville, maybe Madison, Bellevue. Those are your middle income. Maybe these are people that have combined incomes at around $60,000 per year. Household income on average, maybe a little more, a little less than that. Maybe some single family homes ranging up to $200,000, $250,000 for a 3-bedroom, 2,000 square foot home. I mean, that's sort of what you find in Antioch and Madison and places like that, Bellevue and so on and so forth. Now, on this model, Zone 5 is called the Commuting Zone. On other versions of the Concentric zone model, we've also seen that called the high income housing zone. And so we have places such as Brentwood and Mount Juliet and Belmead and Green Hills and Oak Hills and Nashville. You start getting out into this, what they call the commuting zone. And so I guess a question that might come to mind is, well, why have our cities developed like this? Why do we have these rings? Well, the automobile has had a significant impact in shaping our cities. We have the interstate highways that traverse through all of our major cities in the United States that allow for people to live out here in these suburbs where actually land is cheaper the farther we move away from the central city, which might surprise you, given that in Zone 3 we have public housing. Just because the housing holds low-income individuals, this is public housing that's owned by the government, okay? When we get farther out, that land gets cheaper and cheaper, so people are able to afford larger houses and lawns and things like that. The square footage, the price per square foot goes up significantly when you start to move in towards the inner city. But out in this commuting zone, people can live 20, 30, 40 miles away from where they work in Zone 1 or perhaps Zone 2 and still get to work every day by driving. That's something that is very unique to this country. If you meet people from other parts of the world who come here, one thing that they'll say is they're fascinated by the fact that you can drive anywhere in the United States. You know, we take it for granted, get in your car and drive. Can't do that everywhere. Can't do that everywhere in the world. Vehicle ownership in other parts of the world is nothing like it is here, especially when we start getting into the developing world. Here, there are more cars in the United States than there are licensed drivers. We have more cars than people who are licensed to drive them. In other parts of the world, there might be one car for every 1,000 people. You know, maybe 2 or 3 cars per 1,000 people. It's so in other parts of the world, you see people walking, riding buses, on bicycles, on rickshaws, and just not driving cars because they don't have the road infrastructure that we do to support vehicles. But if you go to the readings or the assigned readings for this assignment, you will find what I think something that is interesting or that you should do is there's a video that you should watch called The End of Suburbia that really tells the story of how we wound up where we are, being a very car-dependent population. And I won't do a spoiler alert, but you will watch The End of Suburbia and you'll get a pretty good idea of how we got into the situation that we are in terms of being completely dependent upon the automobile and having that automobile essentially shape our cities. You know, that's why we have concentric zones like this. Now, in other cities, such as probably the best case I can think of is Atlanta, Georgia, those cities have created multiple zones, and we have more of what we call a multiple nuclei model here. So we might have a downtown, but then there are other areas that are almost mini downtowns. So if we're speaking in terms of Atlanta, we have the downtown area down there Olympic Park, and where the Coca-Cola in the state capitol and all that. It's Coca-Cola headquarters and the state capitals all downtown Atlanta. But then if you go farther out, there's Buckhead, which is almost an entire city unto itself. And then there are other smaller regions, there's the Decatur, that are almost cities unto themselves outside of downtown. And so you have a different kind of traffic pattern there. I guess ideally, if you live someplace like Atlanta, if you live, say, in Sandy Springs or Roswell, you can pretty much confine your life there. You can work in Roswell, live in Roswell, and not necessarily have to go engage in commuting to downtown Atlanta and then back out. Although, as you all know, lots of people in Atlanta definitely do that. So let's look at these models and how they relate to the various urban inequalities issues that we're going to be talking about. So let's start where we are at Tennessee State at Zone 3. Zone 3 is probably, zones 3 and 2 are probably the most actively changing zones in cities in the US right now, obviously through gentrification. So what is gentrification? The root of the word gentrification is gentry. And that is when we have people from higher income brackets and much greater wealth move into what used to be low income areas. It doesn't sound controversial on its face, but what are the driving factors? Why are people moving from out here in the suburbs, nice, big lawns, big houses, to zones 2 and 3, where they might end up living next to a microbrewery or living next to a small packaging plant? Why would they want to do that? What's driving this? People are getting less square footage for their homes when they move into these places closer to inner cities. So why do it? Well, there are several factors driving gentrification in the modern day. One is demographics and population. What used to be the largest generation of our times, which was the baby boomers. So the baby boomers were born between 1944 and 1964, roughly. That's when the fertility rate for the United States was 4. That means the average woman in the United States had 4 children during her primary reproductive years, from about 1944, 45 to 1964. Well, what was going on? Well, it was the end of the Second World War. A lot of soldiers, who mostly were men, came back from the war. They had a lot of, I guess, I don't want to call them perks, but benefits. There was the GI Bill. A lot of them went to college. There was the Federal Housing Act that provided very, very low interest loans to these soldiers. And so that just set them up to start families. I mean, most of these were young men. And of course, it was a different time back then, in the 40s and 50s, where, women didn't have the opportunities that they have now. The birth control pill hadn't been introduced yet. And so it was a perfect formula for population increase. The United States became the manufacturing king of the world because the rest of the world actually experienced the Second World War on their soil. With the exception of Pearl Harbor, there were no bombs falling on New York. There were no bombs falling on Pittsburgh. There were no bombs falling on Chicago or Detroit. And so after the Second World War, we were easily able to transition from making tanks to making cars and other products. And so there was a time in the immediate period after the Second World War where 99% of the cars made in the world were made in the United States, and actually in one state, in Michigan. And so this manufacturing boom really led to what was the greatest era of prosperity our country has ever seen. And in most cases, increased prosperity results in increased fertility. People have money, they have more children, right? So that's what was happening during the baby boom. Now, those baby boomers are now probably anywhere from about 56 years of age to maybe 75. So they're hitting retirement age. They were the generation that moved out to the suburbs, you know, as you'll see in the videos associated with the race, the power of an illusion. You know, when we saw this expansion into suburbs, this happened after the Second World War. We saw in the End of Suburbia, you'll see that there was an period of time after the Second World War where the automobile became a lot more ubiquitous. The interstate highway system came online, and the car became king and allowed people to move out to these suburbs. And it created an entirely new lifestyle that, as we know, eventually has evolved into some of the serious inequalities that we see today in urban areas. You know, this suburban sprawl that has happened and is still happening, and to some degree in some urban areas. So that generation that moved to the suburbs during the 40s and 50s had families. Their children by now have left the nest. They're older. It gets more difficult to maintain a home when you get older. The homes are large. Maybe people don't want to be in these big homes and there's no children around. Maybe some of the homes have more than one floor. And maybe people don't want to walk up and down steps anymore. And so as a lot of these people are downsizing. Right now, the baby boomer generation still holds 70% of the wealth of this country. That generation holds 70% of this country's wealth right now. So yeah, they have property, it's easy for them to sell this home in the suburbs and downsize and move into a condo downtown, someplace more walkable, that's an easy access to everything that they need as services start to move into the downtown area behind the residential development. We start to see grocery stores. So for example, in Nashville, now there's a Publix downtown. There's a Whole Foods downtown. You know, first there were no grocery stores downtown. Nobody was really living down there. But now we're starting to see services downtown that follow the residential development. So the demographics is one thing in terms of the baby boomers downsizing. Then we get to the next largest group, which are the millennials. So the millennials are essentially the children of the baby boomers. Even though birth rates were cut in half by a number of things, women getting more opportunities, the birth control, medically induced birth control significantly cut the fertility rate for women, we still had large numbers of children just because the baby boomers were such a large group. So now we have the millennials, which I believe either are very close to being the largest generation that we have within our population in the United States today. So millennials range from maybe 25 or so. And this, the definition of these generations differs from place to place. But I would say from about 25 to maybe 45 or so, right in there, maybe early 40s down to 25 or maybe maybe mid 30s. It's arguable, but right in that range, 20 something and 30 something. Let's just say that. Now, this generation, the millennials are very different from the baby boomers. I think the average age for a woman to have her first child during the baby boom might have been lower in 20s, maybe 22, 23. Now it's getting up over 25. People are putting off having children, putting off being married. The millennial generation is a lot less car dependent. A lot of millennials don't have cars for two reasons. A, the lifestyle doesn't require a car. And B, as I said, the baby boomer generation has the bulk of the wealth in this country. Millennials might not be able to afford cars, even into their 30s. So they are more prone to live in a place where they don't necessarily need to have a house with a yard. The main reason that people have a yard is so their kids can have some place to go outside and play and be safe. If you don't have any children and you're in your 20s and early 30s and you're still single, you don't want to deal with all that maintenance of a house, perhaps. And so, you know, that's where we find a lot of millennials preferring to live in the inner city, car-free lifestyle, you know, being more into that urban type of life of going out at night and being a young single person that's not conducive to living way out in the suburbs somewhere and living more of a settled family life. So those are two of the things in terms of demographics that are driving gentrification. Another thing that is happening surprisingly now was we had a huge significant spike in the price of gasoline that occurred in combination with the recession of a couple of recessions. And so the increase in gasoline prices really started to have people living in the suburbs reconsider the way they were doing things. I used to live in the suburbs, and my gasoline bill was anywhere from $200 to $250 a month. I used to live in Madison. When I moved back downtown, my gasoline expenditures went down to maybe $80 per month. So if you think about that, if that extra, say, $200 a month, instead of going into the pockets of Shell or Arco or Texaco or Mobil or whomever, BP, I can now put in the bank. So that's at least on the low end, $2,000 saved per year. After 3 years, that's $6,000. After 5 years, that's $10,000. That's a down payment on a house, right? As opposed to putting it in the gas tank. And so a lot of people, because of the higher cost of gasoline, change their lifestyle. Why are we living out here, driving back and forth in the suburbs, putting all this wear and tear on our car? Some people have found that they can live closer to the inner city and become a one-car family. Don't have the kids to drive around, especially people in the baby boomer generation. Kids aren't being driven around to soccer practice, to here, to there, to baseball practice, to ballet practice, whatever. We can have one car, significantly downsize our lifestyle by moving into zone 2 or zone 3. So all of these driving factors have produced the gentrification phenomenon that we have seen for the last at least 3 decades easily in inner cities. Also, in terms of markets, the manufacturing sector has declined. And so in zone 2 and 3, there were some cases in zone 2 and 3 where there was some medium level industry that shut down. Maybe some small auto parts manufacturers shut down. Maybe some small auto parts facility shut down and became a closed down factory. And so in a lot of cities, especially in the more industrialized cities, a lot of the manufacturing sector became barren. And those old factories Old wood processing plants, old lumber yards are now what we call brownfield sites. So what's a brownfield? A brownfield site is a property that either has actual or perceived contamination that can be extraordinarily expensive to clean up if federal Superfund guidelines are followed to the letter. See, there's the letter of the law, and then there's the spirit of the law. The letter of the law is when you follow the law exactly as it is written. The spirit of the law is when we do follow a law, but we want to get to the same end, but maybe the law is so strict we can't get to the end that we want. So with the Superfund law, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, that law was brought about when we, as a population here in the United States, discovered that there were a lot of these abandoned toxic properties for which no one claimed responsibility. And so Superfund essentially you taxed the petroleum and chemical industry, produced a fund that was used to pay to clean up the sites after the sites, or during which the sites were being cleaned up. The federal government would then sue the parties responsible for leaving the contamination there in the first place. So if it was an old chemical plant or what have you, and the owners abandoned the plant in the 1970s, and now perhaps in the 1980s, the waste was discovered. The federal government would clean it up using the federal funding, but actually they would go and sue the owners of that facility who were responsible for that cleanup. Okay. Now, in terms of urban development, the strict liability associated with Superfund presented a problem. What usually happened was, even if the federal government found whoever owned the facility, that person or that company didn't necessarily just open their pockets and say, oh yeah, sure, we'll pay for it. They'll claim, oh no, we didn't know that stuff was poisonous. The laws it wasn't illegal to dump toxic waste back then. We didn't know it was toxic. We're not going to pay up. Matter of fact, we're going to countersue. And a lot of those cases just wound up tangled up in the courts. Meanwhile, the sites weren't cleaned up. And again, this is very valuable land in zones 2 and 3. So it wasn't as if this wasn't valuable land. This was very valuable land. However, as long as a rusting old car plant or what have you was there, nothing was going to happen. Or a dry cleaning plant or something like that in the middle of or close to residential property, nothing was going to happen there as long as these cases were in court, and the people who lived in the community next door to these facilities wound up having their property being devalued, because who would want to live next to a dump, right? So the Brownfields Act essentially was a compromise on the Superfund law from the federal government. The federal government said, okay, we'll let you clean these sites up, landowner, property owner, but you don't have to clean it up to what we call background levels or pristine levels. The Superfund law required that these sites be cleaned up to the point that you didn't even know the plant was there in the first place, which would be extremely expensive. So what Brownfields allows are alternative cleanup strategies. So perhaps you could put some microbes in that will clean up the contaminated soil instead of having to truck that soil away at millions and millions of dollars of cost. Or maybe you could stabilize the concrete instead of hauling all the contaminated soil away. Maybe you could inject some form of substance that would clean up the contaminated groundwater instead of having to pump millions of gallons of groundwater out, or do something else that would be extraordinarily expensive that would be a deterrent to anyone who had any potential to develop these places in the inner city. The Brownfields laws allowed for these sites to be cleaned up according to their most likely use, right? So if a hazardous waste site has to be cleaned up to pristine levels, the assumption is that these sites are going to become residential properties where children are going to be playing, and you wouldn't want children playing in toxic waste or have any chance of coming anywhere near toxic waste, right? But in most cases, these facilities were not necessarily going to become residential property zoned. In almost every case, they were going to be commercial, or now what we call mixed use in some cases. But in a lot of cases, we have commercial property. So for example, a lot of the stadiums, like the Titan Stadium in Tennessee, the Panthers Stadium in Charlotte, the Ravens Stadium in Baltimore, these were all contaminated brownfield sites that were cleaned up and are now used commercially. So I guess the presumption is, okay, it's safe enough to have a football game here. We might not want to live here, but we can have a football or baseball game on this property. So we'll allow for the property to be cleaned up within an affordable range for a developer. So let's put some numbers on it. Let's say that if a developer cleaned the site up to pristine level, it would cost $300 million, right? Developer is going to be, no, we're not doing that. But let's say under brownfields provisions, they're allowed to do an alternative cleanup that might cost $100 million. Yeah, let's go ahead and build that stadium. Let's build whatever, right? And so that's essentially what happened. And so as these brownfield sites were cleaned up, the land around them became a lot more attractive for residential development. So for instance, in Nashville, if you've ever been to the Ascend Amphitheater, or know where that is downtown, that used to be a giant waste burning facility called thermal. It was a cogeneration plant where they burned tons, hundreds of thousands of tons of garbage would go down there and be burned and converted into electricity. I'm simplifying the process, but that's essentially what happened. It was a very ugly, nasty place. Nobody wanted to live anywhere near there. But eventually the city, through its brownfields agreement, got that property cleaned up, turned into the Ascend Amphitheater. Now there's all kinds of very expensive residential condominiums and apartments all around, other businesses and restaurants all around Ascend Amphitheater now that would not be there had that still been that big, nasty facility, which eventually burned down and which made it a brownfield site. But the question is, and here's where the controversy is, the types of property that spring up around these formerly abandoned sites is usually pretty pricey, usually pretty high end, which drives up tax rates, which results in displacement due to people unable to pay higher tax prices. In zones 2 and 3, we have a very high percentage of people who are renters. They don't own the property. That's what's happening in Nashville right now. As the property values are going up in Nashville, a lot of these building owners who own buildings that had affordable rents are now being tempted by developers waving millions and millions and millions of dollars in front of them. And some of them are selling out. They're like, hey, and so once a building owner sells that building, the residences in the building have no rights to stay there any longer. The new owner does have to honor the existing leases, but once those leases run out, they can charge any amount of rent they want to. And so a lot of people in Nashville are being displaced like that. I know people have moved 2 and 3 times because just for that reason. And sometimes these developers are very aggressive and do some things that are just downright illegal. They'll come in and say, well, we're not going to honor your lease. You got 30 days to get out. And sometimes people don't realize that that is a violation. Or the landlord will say, well, you will honor your lease, but I know you weren't paying for water and garbage and electricity before, but you're gonna have to pay that now, right? Which is illegal. But people have to get some form of legal representation to avoid those types of things from happening. And so, so those are just some of the driving points behind gentrification. Again, demographics, higher fuel prices, and the fact that a lot of these brownfield sites have been transitioned into much more attractive property that has resulted in investment in residential properties around them that tend to be very high end, very expensive. And so as a result, you get a lot of the lower income residents who can't afford to live there anymore. And so it's an issue that we see playing out in Nashville, especially now, which has resulted in a lot of inequalities in terms of people not being able to afford to live anywhere near where they might find a job. So we have the issue of job sprawl, where we have development moving away from where people can afford to live. So you might have someone who might be a custodian, who might be cleaning up a commercial property, but can't live anywhere near it because it's too expensive. And then when you throw in the fact that public transit may not be accessible or efficient, and so you have people who are unable to get to work by any means. And so that's the situation that we have that drives a lot of urban inequalities to the fore. So as you go through these materials, I absolutely want you to, again, pick out some specific issues, such as you might want to look at urban renewal. What was urban renewal and what relationship does it have to what's happening today? Well, if you read about urban renewal, historically, what happened in a lot of cities in the 1930s, especially following the Depression of the 1930s, we saw a lot of people living in substandard housing in cities, housing without running water, housing without air conditioning or heat, housing without indoor toilets, right? People using outhouses in the middle of the city, which really brought a lot of unhealthy living conditions in those areas. People living in tenements, people living in shacks, people living in shotgun houses in the city. Very unhealthy conditions that led to a lot of diseases. And so the urban renewal program was an effort to tear down those unsafe, unhealthy housing conditions. And when the people left those houses, they moved into public housing, or what we call the projects. And so back in the 1940s and 50s, and perhaps even into the 60s, a move into the projects was a move up. You move from a shack into a place that had running water, that had air conditioning, that had electricity in some cases. In some cases, some of these homes, even in the cities, especially in the South, didn't even have electricity. Now, unfortunately, these public housing properties, took people who were dispersed, who were low income, and concentrated them into these singular places where everybody was poor, right? And then after the 1960s, The United States government became a little bit more conservative. There was inflation came about. There was some energy crisis. And so the general mentality of the United States government and population was conservative in that less money was being put into federal programs such as HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And so you had less federal dollars going into public housing. It was the burden of the cost was put more on the states. And of course, public housing went into disrepair and became the drug-infested, crime-infested places that we see up until this day. Concentrated poverty, everything around those properties became very unattractive and just downright unsafe. But one of the consequences of urban renewal, again, it resulted in concentrated poverty, but from a personal standpoint, a lot of people lost their homes, and the home wasn't the best place in the world, or the house wasn't the best place in the world, but it was a home. Maybe some people were born in those houses. They weren't born in the hospital room. They were born in those houses. Maybe their parents built those houses with their own hands. And now the government comes along, tears all those houses down and says, oh, you can go move into this public housing facility, which, okay, had running water, had all these other amenities, but it really wasn't home. And so a lot of people had a lot of issues with that. And then, of course, you can look at this article, The Racist Roots of Urban Renewal. So one of the things that people used to say was that urban renewal was Black removal. And so a lot of the property that used to be in the hands of Black people was handed over after those homes were raised. So, for example, in Nashville, all the property where the Sound Stadium is, all the property around Bicentennial Mall, the Farmers Market, all that property down around the Capitol, that was all a Black community that was swept away through urban renewal. And those people wound up in public housing. And we know what happened in public housing. And so I also want, at the end of the readings, we have some, solutions. One of the solutions was the Hope 6 program, solutions to urban inequalities. So of course, concentrated poverty in public housing caused significant urban inequalities that we still see to this day. So what was Hope 6? Hope 6 was a federal program that tore down, where the governments would tear down these housing facilities and replace them with mixed income communities. Let's just say that. That was the vision. Okay, so if we have people living in concentrated poverty, specifically children, and they look around, there's no fathers in the homes because it was essentially illegal to do that, right? Public housing is largely for single women with children. It's basically illegal to have a man there. You have nobody working. So maybe you have 90% of the people not going to work, and then a child grows up in that environment, which is supposed to be a temporary stay. Public housing is not meant to be a lifetime stop. It's supposed to be temporary. But if all you see are people not going to work, having babies very young at age 15, 16, 12, young men getting involved in crime almost as a rites of passage, and that's all people see. Next thing, you've got generational poverty. Generations of young men in prison. You're in prison with your daddy and your granddaddy, right? And so the thought was, let's tear down these cesspools of negativity and rebuild it so that we have a mixture of incomes. Sounds like a great idea, right? But unfortunately, you can't snap your finger and rebuild a housing community. It takes time. And during those times, people had to move out of the projects. Where'd they go? Well, that wasn't something that was planned for. A lot of these families, a lot of families could not move back in. It wasn't a one-to-one deal. After the new communities were built, not only could they just hold less people, maybe you might have started off with 4,000 units in the original public housing community. The new property has 2,000 units or maybe 2,500. So you automatically have 1,500 people that aren't coming back. Then on top of that, there's new rules. Can't have a felony, might have to have relatively good credit. That eliminates more people. So it was found that maybe is probably about a quarter of the original residents were able to move back in. What happened to the other 3/4 of people? They wound up on Section 8 vouchers somewhere in the middle of nowhere, away from public transportation, away from wherever they might have been able to find a job, away from the health clinic, which puts a lot of women in danger when they get pregnant. So yeah, Hope 6 had some issues. Now, Nashville, oddly enough, was one of the most successful cities in terms of Hope 6. When Nashville got the Hope 6 dollars, they actually rebuilt a lot of these public housing communities, such as Preston Taylor, John Henry Hale Homes. They also rebuilt a couple of other communities in Nashville. So at least for Sam Levy homes were rebuilt through Hope 6. In some cities, the cities got the Hope 6 dollars, tore down the housing projects, never built anything there. Right? In some cities, this was an abject failure for a variety of reasons, fraud, mismanagement, who knows, right? So Hope 6 had a lot of, it was a great vision. But the reality was when you displace people who are already not living under stable conditions, you put them into even more unstable conditions. Some of the people who were most affected negatively were children. So let's say children are living in public housing, and they're going to a school in the neighborhood, or at least they knew exactly where they were going to school. Now you move these people out of the public housing into Section 8. Now the kids in a different school, maybe can't get there because they don't have transportation. Now the child's not going to school, the kid drops out. I mean, it just didn't result. In some cases it worked, and in some cases it didn't work, but for a lot of people, it didn't produce the results that the federal government wanted. So the Hope 6 program is no longer in existence, but a lot of cities, including Nashville, are creating Hope 6-like programs, such as in Envision Casey in Nashville. So you have some readings about how in Nashville, we have the Envision Casey. So Casey Homes is the largest public housing community in Nashville, about 2,400 people, mostly women and children. And there's an effort right now to change that community into a mixed-use residential area. There have been some issues, as you can read here. But again, this is seen as a solution. There are other solutions, such as the HUD Choice Neighborhoods program you can look at. There's the Promise Neighborhood program. There are opportunity zones. There are all kinds of solutions to these problems that you can look at and examine in terms of how well do you think that they're going to work to solve these issues of urban inequality. And so, again, your assignment is to examine urban inequalities, look at these articles. Like I said, you might want to look at public housing and Hope 6, and don't limit yourself to just these articles. I've thought of some just now that I need to post. But particularly, I really want you to, I didn't even mention redlining. So I want you can look at, redlining, which is a direct contributor to the racial wealth gap. So redlining and how it affected housing, equity and wealth equity is really focused upon in this Race, the Power of an Illusion video series. And I'm going to add the End of Suburbia video also. Look at the racial wealth gap and gentrification. You might want to focus on that in your essay, or you might want to look at some of the solutions. How are these solutions faring? Or how are some of these historical issues related to urban inequalities? But in your essay, you should specifically focus upon how gentrification, urban renewal, redlining, and job sprawl, and Hope 6 have impacted each of the 5 zones of the urban concentric zone model. And so I've pretty much given you some outlines of that, but and then also include a case study. Do you know of, is there a Hope 6 property in your city that you know about? Is there gentrification happening in your city that you can just, do you know where part of your city is gentrifying that you can describe, in terms of urban inequalities? And which zone is it in? Is it in zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5? What about job sprawl? I didn't talk about that a lot. How is job sprawl related to one of these zones? I want you to really also discuss the solutions to these urban inequalities. Again, include, you have to please cite your sources and use MLA style citation, in-text citations, and then of course, and that's in this Word document. If you have any questions, please let me know. Hopefully you'll find this assignment interesting, because solving the issues of urban inequalities is something that's very much of concern for mayors and governors all over this country, especially now, once we see this depression unfold to its full fruition. It's going to be especially important now. Okay, so that essay will be due on Thursday, and we will have a live discussion, and hopefully it will be a live and lively discussion. And again, if you have any questions about this assignment, please let me know. You can start a first draft, email it to me, let me take a look at it before you submit it, and I'll say, hey, this looks like you're on the right track, or I might say, hey, you're not getting it all, which means that if you're not getting it, you're not going to turn in something that is totally off base and not get the grade you want. So I encourage that. Okay, so today, hopefully we're off to a good start and this week. And as always, think, work, serve.